he was still inside his own box. That is the detail nobody wants to argue about, because it is the one detail that turns a routine penalty into a pattern. 3 races, 3 5-second penalties. And in this video, you will understand why the team principal, who has defended nearly every one of them, just drew a very careful line between the ones he can excuse and the one he cannot let go. Silverstone first. The lights are still on, all 5 of them, red across the gantry. Lewis Hamilton is sitting in his grid box, engine loaded, foot working the clutch the way every driver on that grid does in the final seconds before a start. Somewhere in that window, the car creeps. 42 millimeters, less than the width of a hand. The onboard sensors, the same sensors that are supposed to catch a jump start before a human even needs to look, register nothing. No infringement flagged, no system alert. It is only when the stewards go back to the footage, frame by frame, that they find the tire has rotated, just slightly, while the lights were still lit. If you want the stories from behind the paddock walls that never make it into the official press releases, subscribe right now and tell me in the comments which country you are watching from. Because the next part of this hits differently depending on where you sit relative to this sport. Here is what makes Silverstone different from an ordinary racing incident. Hamilton was not out of his box. He never left the marked square painted onto the grid. The car moved within its own space, the way a car straining against a clutch bite point sometimes does. And yet the stewards ruled it a breach anyway, citing the regulation that governs starting procedure and handing down the standard 5-second penalty. Hamilton still finished the race in third. But that is not really the point. The point is what came next, because Fred Vasseur did not stay quiet about it. Speaking to reporters at the circuit, Vasseur said, "The decision felt harsh, given that the team's own sensors had shown no movement at all." He added something quieter, almost resigned, about how the stewards do not explain their reasoning once a verdict is issued, so paddock teams are left to simply accept it. That is not a small thing for a team principal to say out loud. This is not an engineer venting in a hospitality unit. This is the man who runs Ferrari's entire operation, standing in front of accredited media, on the record, telling you that the body responsible for policing his driver operates without having to show its work. Keep that phrase in mind. Without having to show its work. It comes back. Because Silverstone was not the end of it. A week later at Spa, Hamilton made contact with George Russell on the opening lap. Russell speared into the gravel and retired on the spot. The stewards handed Hamilton another 5-second penalty. And Vasseur, again in front of the media, pointed out something specific. Every other lap, one incident that season had been waved through as a racing incident. This one was not. He did not call it a conspiracy. He called it tough. Tough and inconsistent with how the same panel had handled nearly identical situations all year. Then, Hungary. A pit lane speeding infraction. The limit was 80 kilometers per hour. Hamilton's car registered a fraction over it. A gap so small that Vasseur described it almost like a rounding error, the kind of number that only matters because the weekend was already going sideways. Third penalty, third race in a row. So was he alongside the driver he hit at Spa? The steward said his room to avoid contact was limited and still penalized him. Was he outside his grid box at Silverstone? No, and the sensors agreed with him. Did he choose to speed in the pit lane at Hungary? Not by any margin a human eye could see without the timing sheet in front of them. 3 different infractions, 3 different mechanisms of enforcement, one driver absorbing all 3 inside a span of weeks. This is where it gets interesting, because Vasseur refuses to treat the 3 as one story. He has been explicit about that. He does not think they belong in the same basket. The Spa incident, he has said, was a racing incident, and if Hamilton had to do it again, he would tell him to do exactly the same thing. Hungary, in his telling, was a small and understandable string of mistakes under pressure. Nothing sinister, but Silverstone is the one he keeps returning to, the one where the censors and the stewards disagreed, and where nobody at the FIA has ever explained why 42 millimeters, invisible to the very system built to detect it, was enough to cost a driver a position. And now, hold that thought, because it has just widened. Hamilton has revealed that this was not just a private grievance. It was raised, formally, inside the driver's briefing. Multiple drivers apparently told the stewards the same thing Vasseur had been saying in public. That the standard for what counts as a false start has been applied inconsistently, that there have been drivers who moved and were not penalized, and that if you are still inside your box when the last light goes out, you should not be facing a sanction at all. According to Hamilton, The stewards agreed with the substance of that argument, and they are, in his words, now looking into changing how jump starts get judged going forward. Read that twice. The regulation was not wrong on the day it was applied to Hamilton, but the people applying it now appear to agree the standard needs to change. That is not vindication. That is something more specific. That is an admission that the tool used to punish him may not have been the right tool at all. If you are not subscribed yet, this is exactly the kind of story you want to already be following when the next verdict lands, because this one is not finished. Let's put the two moments next to each other, without any adjectives attached. In Silverstone, sensors detect 0 movement. Video shows 42 millimeters. Stewards rule it a breach under the article governing starting procedure and apply a 5-second penalty. In the driver's briefing, weeks or perhaps only days later, multiple drivers state to the same officiating body that other cars have moved by similar or greater margins in the past without facing any sanction at all. Neither claim, on its own, proves foul play. Stewards make judgment calls under time pressure, using footage that is not always conclusive, and a governing body that refuses to explain its reasoning is not automatically a governing body acting in bad faith. But put those two facts side by side and ask yourself what the actual standard is. If the same panel can look at similar movement and reach different verdicts depending on the weekend, then the standard is not really a standard. It is a coin flip wearing a uniform. Convert that 5-second penalty into what it actually costs. Hamilton still made the podium at Silverstone, so on paper this one did not bite as hard as it could have. But stack it against Spa and Hungary, both of which did cost him track position, and the picture changes. 3 races, 3 penalties, and according to people inside that briefing room, at least one of those penalties may not have needed to exist under the standard the FIA itself is now trying to write. So what was Vasseur actually supposed to do in that moment? Defend every single penalty publicly and risk looking like he cannot separate a legitimate racing incident from a technical injustice? Or stay quiet on all 3 and let his driver absorb 3 punishments without a single word of pushback from the team paying his salary? He picked neither extreme. He picked the harder path, agreeing with the stewards on Spa, softening Hungary into a string of small mistakes, and drawing a hard line only at Silverstone, where the censors themselves backed his driver up. Now, the case for the other side, because it deserves saying honestly, a governing body that starts explaining every single decision in public risks turning every stewards meeting into a televised trial, with each panel second-guessing itself to avoid criticism. There is a real argument that the FIA's silence protects the independence of the stewards, even if it frustrates the teams on the losing end. That is a defensible position. It is also not the one that survives the comparison between 42 millimeters that got punished and other movements that reportedly did not. Would this penalty have existed if a different driver on a different weekend had made the exact same movement in the exact same window before the lights went out? Nothing in the written reasoning from Silverstone answers that question, because the stewards do not publish comparisons across race weekends. It is not proven that anyone got away with something worse. I am not going to pretend that it is. It is simply a question that anyone who sat through that driver's briefing is entitled to ask out loud, and apparently several of them did. Here is the part that goes beyond one driver having a rough 3 races. Stewarding panels rotate. The officials who reviewed Silverstone are not necessarily the same 4 people who will be sitting in that room at the next round. Regulations get interpreted by whoever happens to be on duty that weekend, using footage and sensor data that do not always agree with each other, the way we just saw. With the tire rotation, nobody's system flagged. That is not a Ferrari problem. That is a structural one, and it is exactly the kind of gap that a formal rule change is supposed to close, if the FIA actually follows through on what Hamilton says they agreed to in that room. Do I know whether this changes anything by the time the season resumes? No, and that is the honest answer, because a promise to look into something for the future is not the same as a rule already rewritten. If I cannot tell you exactly what the new standard will be, and the drivers who raised it in that briefing cannot either, then right now, there is no new standard. There is only an old one that several of the people racing under it no longer trust. Zandvoort is next, and whatever guidance comes out of the next driver's briefing, before a single car turns a wheel there, will tell us whether this was a genuine correction or just a conversation that quietly went nowhere. Vasseur will be watching that room as closely as anyone because the next driver caught in a 42mm argument might not be wearing red. So tell me, is this a pattern the FIA is finally willing to fix, or just a coincidence that happened to land on the same driver 3 times in a row? Vote in the comments. And if you're not subscribed yet, this is the exact kind of story you'll want to be here for when the next verdict drops. Like this video if you think the standard needs to change, drop your take in the comments because the comments are the courtroom on this one, and until the next one.